Are you filming?
Yes.
Okay, good. So there are 6 different energies, and I said before, we've got ideas of weight, we've got ideas of direction, and we've got ideas of constrained and free and all the rest, but let's go through them all. The names of the different types of energies that Laban refers to are flick, dabbing, gliding, floating, punching, slashing, ringing, and pressing. How about that? This is from a dancer's point of view, or a dancer, whatever, point of view as to how you can get different sorts of motions. And what I'd like to do with you today is to also show you that there is an animator's side to each one of these types of energies. So the first one we've got is a flick. Now, when we flick something, we flick it like that. Okay, you're going to flick you. Flick this, move that, just flick that thing, flick it. Okay, that's a flick. If you were to flick a towel, you do that, flick. And that movement of flicking is described by Laban as indirect, quick, light, and free. So indirect, anything that's indirect when we talk about it, when we think about animation, that's anything which follows an articulated motion. In 3D animation, we would call this FK, forward kinematics. In 2D animation, it's like we've got the shoulder connected to the elbow, connected to the wrist, connected to the hand, and as we move them, they describe arcs. So anything that moves in an arc-like manner is, what's the word I said? It is free, it is indirect. The opposite of indirect is direct, where you do something. You can have a dab. The opposite is a dab. If I dab something, I am moving in a direct line, like that, a dab, yeah? As compared to a flick. Now a flick, if I had an object here and I had to flick off a switch, I could flick it off like that. That's a flick. Now in flicking, I am using all of my joints without any direction. I'm just slashing through the air, and all my motions are FK, they are arcs. Everything, if I was to trace any part of my hand, that would create an arc, yes? Whereas a dab has all of the energy of a flick, but it is directed. So I could sit there and touch that elevator button, touch it lightly. Both of these actions are quick, light, and free. But one is indirect, it kind of swashes, and the other one is direct. So in 3D animation, what we're talking about is the difference between using FK kinematics to swap, or IK kinematics, where we move through space in a straight line. Yeah? In 2D animation, it means that when you are creating your arcs, or at least drawing out your arcs of how you're going to move, you need to make sure that your hand, or whatever it is, your tail, or whatever it is that is moving in a direct manner, is moving linearly, or somewhat linearly through space, because nothing moves linearly. It may move through a very, very shallow arc, but it will move in a shallow way through space. So if I was to gingerly press a doorbell and I wasn't really sure about it, I would reach across and I would touch that doorbell. If I was gingerly thinking that there was a thing there and I had to touch it, but I didn't know if it was hot or not, I might just touch the tap to see if it's hot. I'm not going to injure myself. There's nothing particularly direct about that. So as far as my notes about this, when you think about a flick, there is FK animation, or arc-like animation. There is overlap. This is another interesting thing. We all understand what overlap is in terms of drag. If I was to drag my arm, I'm overlapping and dragging my arm. Whereas if I was to move my arm without overlap, it's like this. This is no overlap, this is overlap. Yeah, do you see the difference? One is free, one is constrained. One is free, one is constrained. So that just means that as you are rotating, if it was a 3D animation, you want to make sure that you have what's called progressive breaking of joints. Each rotation follows and lags behind them as we go through space. So if my shoulder rotates first, then my elbow rotates and then catches up slowly. So if I was just dragging my elbow, I would be doing this. If I was dragging my elbow and all of my hand, I would do this. Okay, so that's overlap. So a flick has overlap. A dab doesn't have as much overlap. It is like this. There is no real overlap. A flick has overlap. A dab doesn't. And I said before that the inertia, it's light. So the difference between something that's heavy and light is the spacing. So you would have your movements being a little bit put together, but some sense of inertia. Everything has inertia. Everything moves with inertia. So you can't just have a robot moving like this. We'll talk about robots later on. There is a type of movement that Laban talks about. But there is a movement where it's light, but it still reaches up. When I get to the top, it slows down. And when I go down again, it's also an ease, but it's a light ease as compared to this. That is a heavy, energetic movement, but it is still an arc and it is still moving, but the spacing in terms of your animation will have tight, 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 massive change in spacing, tight, tight, tight at the end to get that snappy feel. And we'll talk about snapping movements later on. Again, speaking to the 3D animators, if you're doing this and you have these motions, your tangents are going to be flat. When you move through space, as the different parts of your rig move through space, the motions on each of those joints are going to be very, very flat. When we get to the top of that, you're going to have a very flat, heavily weighted tangent to show that inertia. In 2D animation, you have to make sure that your spacing curves, your spacing charts show lots of bunching, separation, separation, lots of bunching to get that weight. Okay? What we'll see when we're looking at Toon Boom today is you can actually use a combination of just traditional drawing as well as keyframed animation where you can add tangents and weights, so we can look at tangents and weights in Toon Boom. So that's a flick and a dab. They feel the same, they have the same amount of energy, but one of them is unconstrained and free and floppy. The other one is light but directed. So then we go down to the other two light types of energy. One is called gliding and one is called floating. One of them is direct and one of them is indirect. Gliding is direct, sustained, light and free. So whenever you hear the word free, it means that you're using FK movement. Whenever you see anything which is constrained, you think of an IK movement. Whenever you're thinking of free and indirect, we're talking about overlapping motion. So the difference between a flick and a float is that a float, let me get this right. The flick is indirect and the float is indirect, meaning that there is no direction, whereas a glide moves through space. You glide through space. You dab, but you glide through space. You see the difference? The dab is quick across. The glide, like it says, glide through space. You're gliding, but you have a direction. I'm going somewhere. I'm moving, but I'm gliding somewhere. Whereas if I was floating, I would float like this. So if I wanted to float to that position, I would float like this, as compared to a glide, where I would glide into that position. There's my beginning, there's my end. A glide kind of pushes in. It has a direction, whereas a float, I would just flop into that position. A dab does this, a glide does that. The dab has fast motion, the glide is even spacing all the way through. A flick is sudden but light. A float is slow and even and doesn't have any sudden movements. It just moves through space slowly. Exactly the same kind of movement, isn't it? It's crazy. Here to here. Now I am flicking, I am dabbing, I am gliding, and now I'm floating. Same movement. Tells you something about the emotional state. Person who's nervous would flick, they would dab. Person who's happy would just say, don't worry guys, I'm all in control. Person who glides is just over there. Take it easy. It's a positive kind of controlled but light associated to your emotional state. Do you want to pause the video and we'll start a new one so I don't have massively long ones?